Good morning, everybody. Incredibly exciting to be here. When I got the invitation, the idea of going inside a building that I've been past probably 10,000 times and have read so much about, and I'm sort of amazed by the space. You sort of imagine it's going to be teeny and tiny, and in fact it's huge and wonderful. So the first excitement is to be here with you, but of course the second major excitement is to be here with Elif, who I have come to know very well over the years, and for whom it's always just an incredible happiness to be here. And we're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk around Elif's extraordinary new book, which some of you may have read. Just out of interest, how many people have read it? It's only just out, so that's already quite a few people. It came out about a month and a half ago. There are rivers in the sky. I've had it for some months because I got an early proof, so I was able to devour it as I devour everything you write. In certain respects, and I say this positively because we've discussed, we both like complexity. Life is complex. It deals with four interweaving stories set geographically apart and also temporally apart. Can we begin at the beginning? Before we get into the detailed stories, without giving everything away, when you're writing a book that deals with different places and different times, how do you go about thinking that through and then writing it?
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure for me to share stage with you, to be here with you. So thank you so much for coming, for being here. I think I wondered if I could build an entire novel on something as small and as seemingly insignificant as a drop of water. Right? So even though this looks like an epic book, if I may use that word, in the sense that it spans countries and centuries and cultures, everything in this book is connected via one tiny raindrop. And I did not want to take that raindrop for granted. I wanted to honor that raindrop. And I say this as a writer who comes from the Middle East. For us, water is not some theoretical, abstract question. It is an acute crisis. Today, when we talk about climate crisis, we're primarily talking about freshwater crisis. And it's so easy to forget that we're living in a moment of water scarcity. Because we look around, there are flash floods, there are sea levels rising, so it feels like there's an abundance of water. But the paradox, the irony is, amidst that abundance, we're going through water scarcity. There isn't enough fresh water in the world. And of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So basically our rivers are dying. And this has massive consequences. Where there's no water, you will see an increase in political extremism, in violence, gender violence. Women are water carriers. When there's no water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for violence on the way or on the way back. So all these issues might seem to be quite separate, but actually they are connected. And I think I wanted to say, if we want to remember how connected we are as human beings with each other, but also with nature, maybe we should look no further than the story of a drop of water. So that's how the story begins. This raindrop falls on the head of a mighty king called Ashurbanipal in the Assyrian Empire. And from thereafter it journeys. And I'd love to, if we have time, say a few words about that journey.
We'll definitely have time. I want to settle on each of the periods and each of the main characters, because I think each is different but has points of connection. But I want to begin actually with the personal aspect. Like you, water is it's a big part of all of our lives, but it's a big part of my working life. The very first case I ever did at the International Court of Justice was a dispute between Slovakia and Hungary over the River Danube. And for more than 30 years, disputes over water have been subjects that I've been very engaged in. Hence, this book touched me very deeply. When did you start thinking about water? Because as children, certainly living in London, not so far from here, you sort of take it for granted. The tap goes on, stuff comes out. And when did you start thinking about water, and how did you start thinking about water?
Yeah, I think a couple of things came together. I'm always interested in ecofeminism, the kind of feminism that tries to connect the dots. And I think we cannot be single-issue people, especially in this age. Like, if you care about climate crisis, you have to care about gender equality. If you care about gender equality, we have to care about racial equality or regional equality and so on. So the kind of feminism that tries to look out for those connections, that's very close to my heart. But if I may share maybe a few things, I've been very drawn to this place in Turkey called Hasankeyf. Maybe you're familiar with its story. The old name is Castrum Kefa. We're talking about a 12,000-year-old settlement. Ancient, historically important, archaeologically incredibly precious, but also important for biodiversity, you know. If you go to that place today, you will not find it. It is inundated, it's submerged, because the government in Turkey insisted. They built a dam, a very controversial dam project in that location, which has the lifespan, this dam has the lifespan of 50 years, 50. In order to hog water for 50 years, you destroy 12,000 years history, and also it's not a solution, as you said. We're going to have water crisis, maybe water wars in the future, so we have to find international, global solutions, but that's not the vision. It's very short term at the moment. So that one thing led to another. That took me to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then when you observe the Thames, I love this river. But we have to bear in mind that this is a zombie river. Not that long ago, the Thames was declared dead, biologically dead. Why? Because we mistreated the river to such an extent that nothing could live inside this river anymore, was the verdict. And yet, the river managed to renew itself, make a new beginning. Today it's home to more than hundreds of biospecies. However, as humans, we never learn anything. And again, as we're speaking today, in the name of greed, in the name of money, water companies are still pumping sewage back into the Thames. So when you follow the journey of water, it feels like you want to question, what is progress? Have we really made progress as human beings? Is history really linear? Does the arc of history really bend towards justice as we want to believe it does? Or is it actually more cyclical, you know, and we have to be aware of those repetitions, the danger of repetitions in human history?
So you start this book back in the Syrian Empire, in Mesopotamia. How did you settle? Tell us more about the character, the main character, how you settled on him and those around him, and why you made that, why you chose that as the starting point.
Yeah, I really appreciate. So you might remember we mentioned how this drop of water lands on the head of this mighty king, who is actually renowned for the library he built, the library of Ashurbanipal, which changed the course of history. So we're talking about the most learned, cultured, educated king that the empire had ever seen. But that doesn't mean he was less cruel than his predecessors. The interesting thing about Nineveh is when it's destroyed, and empires always think they're here forever, but so did Assyrian Empire think. But when everything was destroyed by their enemies, the library was also burnt down. But the interesting detail is, unlike papyrus or unlike paper, if you burn down a library full of clay tablets, you will only harden, you will only make them stronger. And that's how they remained and how they survived under the ground for so long, albeit in shattered form, broken, until French and British archaeologists came and unearthed them, which takes us into another controversial subject. But if I may pause there, the main three characters in this book, they are connected to each other like atoms in a water molecule, like in H2O. So the person at the heart, the oxygen, he's the oxygen in the story, is called King Arthur of the sewers and the slums. And there's a reason why he's given this unusual name. He's born in Victorian England. He's born in the slum tenements of Chelsea at the time, into severe poverty, not given any proper education. Had he been alive today, I think we would respect and recognize the beauty of his mind, the neurodivergence of his mind, and appreciate that. But of course, at the time, he gets no appreciation. Purely by coincidence, he comes to the British Museum and he sees these shattered clay tablets that were brought from the Middle East. Yeah? Now, this character was loosely based on an actual historical figure called George Smith. And I was very drawn to this person, about whom we know very little, other than he discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh. He discovered the flood tablet, which is so crucial because what he reads in the flood tablet is a story about an ark or a coracle in which there are human beings, animals, there's a deluge, there's floods, they're looking for land, they fly a bird to see if there's land nearby. The story is very familiar, isn't it? So he realizes it's the biblical story of Noah, except the story he has discovered was written thousands and thousands of years before the Old Testament. So it literally divides the Victorian society into two camps. Those who are more religion-oriented, they would say, well, you see, it shows that the Holy Book was right, it really happened. But those who are more scientific-minded would say, actually, as humanity, we've been telling the same old stories to ourselves again and again across the flow of time.
And stories are really at the heart of everything you write. It's how one generation, one person in one place communicates, often through an oral tradition, but not always, as you've described here, to another community. You pick up this story through the British Museum. You do a lot of research. I mean, it's very clear. Anything you've ever read by Elif, you will understand there is a mountain of research that has gone into it. You must have spent time at the British Museum.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience? I mean, many people here will have been to the British Museum, and I've also, for a book that I've been working on that will come out next year, spent an inordinate amount of time at the British Museum with a couple of objects. Can you say a little bit more about your own experience with these objects and how it connects you to these past times about which you write?
Yeah, thank you so much. So beautiful. I so appreciate that we're talking about this. I did spend quite a lot of time inside the British Museum, also, bombarding some scholars who are working at the British Museum with my questions, big and small, and
they're fantastic.
They are fantastic.
I don't know if you've dealt with people who are museum curators. I mean, museum curators and archivists are the best in the world. I mean, they are just extraordinary people.
Absolutely, and I'm very grateful to them. I did an insane amount of research for this book. I hope, it will, I don't know, there will be a substance in it when you read it. But it was very interdisciplinary research or interdisciplinary thinking. I love it when we go beyond our comfort zones. I like it when a novelist becomes interested in physics, about which I know nothing, or a scientist is drawn to poetry, or a poet becomes interested in film theory. Those are the conversations that really, really nourish our minds. And also, I think we need to broaden our reading list. They shouldn't be only Eurocentric. Let's read from East and West, North and South. And the other thing that was very crucial for me was to remember that oral culture and oral storytelling is also very important. Now, I come from a country where history, the way it's taught, is mostly his story, by which I mean the story of a very few men, sultans and Shaykhul Islams, men in positions of power and privilege. But the moment you start asking what was life like for an Armenian silversmith in the Ottoman Empire, for a Jewish miller, for an Arab peasant, for a Kurdish farmer, or a Greek sailor, there's a big silence. What was life like for women in the Ottoman Empire? Huge silence. Or men who had no access to power, what was it like for them? So if we want to understand those silences better, I think we need to turn towards oral culture, oral storytelling, and I had to do a lot of that as well. I think writers need to be a bit like linguistic archaeologists. We need to dig deep into layers of history, try to understand not only the stories, but also the silences. But if there's one important artifact that was very inspiring for me, was the big lamassus. When you go to the British Museum, these incredible sculptures, they weigh between 20 to 40 tons. They're hybrid creatures, part human, part bird, part bull or lion, and they're there. You know, how did they come here? What was their journey like? Some of them were lost on the way. We never talk about this. At the bottom of the river Tigris, there are lamassu sculptures. Because of accidents, you know, they sunk. So there's a lot of loss as well in that story. But if I may quickly add this, one of the many reasons why I love literature, especially the novel as a genre, is because inside novel there's room for pluralism, there's room for nuance, unlike on social media, unlike this divided, extremely polarized world that we're living in. Inside literature there are nuances. So I can be quite critical of colonial institutional history. You might agree or disagree with me, but I think there's a lot of criticism that needs to be done. But at the same time, I can appreciate the genuine dedication of archaeologists, scholars, who, you know, lost their lives, like George Smith. He's buried today in the Middle East between Turkey and Syria because he died there in order to find the missing lines in the poem of Epic of Gilgamesh. So there's a part of me that appreciates him, but there's another part of me that wants to question institutional history. And inside a novel, you can do all of those things, and you can do many more. You can ask questions about what was the Ottoman Empire doing in the meantime, right?
You do it in a very beautiful way because you don't impose a conclusion on the reader. You're laying out the material and allowing the reader to form her own view, their own view, his own view. And that's complex because there must be times as you're dealing with some of this material that you want to shout and you want to impose, but your style of writing is restrained, which I love.
Yeah, I very much appreciate this because it matters to me. I think a writer's job is not to try to give answers, definitely not try to lecture, preach, teach. I don't know the answers myself. You know, I'm learning with every book. It's an ongoing journey. We're always students of life. And I don't like it when novels try to preach or teach at all. But I think a writer's job is to ask questions and to chase those questions and open up a space in which a variety of opinions can be heard, a plurality, you know, can be shared, and then you have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. I know couples who have been married for so long, they read the same novel, one of them loves it, the other one not so much. You know, I've met friends who share everything, every little secret. They read the same book, one of them loves this character, the other one feels attached to a completely different character. Because the reader is not passive. The reader brings their own gaze into the story. So I need to respect that diversity. But I think as a storyteller, my job is just to ask the questions, including difficult questions.
Actually, we have a little group of us, including my wife, have a WhatsApp group in which we're focusing on a single book, which is Colin Toybin's new novel, Long Island, which is wonderful. And it deals exactly with that issue. We've all got completely different perspectives on what happens next. And it's actually quite gendered in terms of the reactions. Our group of 6, 3 males, 3 females, has divided pretty much along gender lines on our reaction to aspects of the book and where it goes. Do you find that also with your work more generally? It's probably too early to know in relation to this book. Whether there is also a gendered aspect to how your readers react.
You know, one thing that makes me very happy and very grateful, so much gratitude in my heart, is to see the diversity of my readership. I really mean this. People from all walks of life, all ethnic, cultural, religious, no religious background, all of them. Maybe people who don't necessarily break bread together. The fact that they're reading the same book means a lot to me. That said, something I observe, male readers above a certain age, usually of a certain, background, upbringing, with all good intentions, they come and say to me, so much is happening in the world today, so I read more about finance and technology and politics, history, the important things. I don't have time for fiction, they say. And then apologetically they say, but my wife reads fiction. Or my girlfriend reads fiction. And I feel really, really sad when I hear this. I think inside a novel, there is politics, there is philosophy, there is psychology, but more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions, especially in this age in which emotions guide and misguide politics. This is the age of angst. And it's a pity that populist demagogues understand this better. So it's changing. There are many young men today reading fiction. I love that. But I think we need to cross that gender barrier. We need to encourage more men to read fiction.
But also the line that is said to be drawn between fiction and non-fiction, I think is problematic. I mean, I've been, for the thing I've been working on, very immersed in the literature of Roberto Bolaño, a novelist. And yet, when you scratch on the surface, I think, as with your books, you see that it is drawn not only from personal experience, but from real characters and real events. I want to move forward a little bit in time because we want to cover our 4 moments. We then jump from the Thames and Arthur and 1840 London to a more recent time, one that I know well because I am involved as counsel in some cases involving what happened to the Yazidi community. We're now in Turkey in 2014. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
So you might remember we spoke about these 3 characters, the H2O, we talked about oxygen, Arthur. One of the hydrogen atoms, one of these 3 characters in this book, is a little Yazidi girl called Narin. And she lives in Hasan Cave, this place that is submerged completely today, with her grandmother, so she experiences displacement. And they journey into Iraq. Unfortunately, the year is 2014, when ISIS fanatics launched their horrific genocide against the Yazidi minorities. Now, when we talk about the Yazidis, we're talking about one of the most vulnerable, beautiful but vulnerable minorities in the world. And the Yazidi lore, because cultural memory is transmitted orally most of the time, the Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres at least throughout their history. But the one in 2014 happened in front of the eyes of the world. And the very first thing that ISIS did actually was so deliberate. They killed the water first. They poisoned the water. So they poisoned all the wells, all the fountains, leaving no water to drink for the communities. And then the second thing they did, again very deliberately, was to kill all the elderly. People above a certain age, all of them were massacred. And in a community like the Yazidis, when you kill the elderly, you're killing collective memory. And you're killing collective identity. Then they killed the men and they kidnapped women and children. And your work is so important, Philippe, because as we are speaking, there are still more than 3,000 Yazidi women still missing in ordinary, quote-unquote, neighborhoods across the Middle East. And coincidentally, while I was writing this book, a girl was saved in a neighborhood in Ankara, very close to my maternal grandmother's house, where I grew up until I was 10 years old. So literally a few streets away, this young woman, I should say, she had been kept there as a sexual slave for years and years. So it struck me very hard, like how is it possible that the neighborhood doesn't know? How is it possible that we become numb, indifferent? In that sense, the Yazidi genocide is not over yet.
And that also, again, relates to our lives in a very direct way, because Britain is one of the countries that has not allowed a single Yazidi in as a refugee or as an asylum seeker. Germany, for example, took 1,200 young women, talking about 13, 14-year-olds, who are abducted and then serially and industrially raped for a year and a half. And Germany sets up a program of post-trauma psychological treatment, Baden-Württemberg and other parts of Germany, and we take in 0. That is what we have become. And most people, it's not a critique of anyone in this room, are completely unaware of what has happened, despite the connections with our own history this is complex, indirectly contributing to the circumstances that have given rise to these horrors decades or centuries ago.
Indeed, you're so right, and I think it's such a shame that we haven't welcomed a single Yazidi refugee when these horrors have happened. As you said, there are important centers, trauma centers, because there's a lot of individual and collective healing that needs to be done. Perhaps one thing we haven't added is ISIS not only killed communities, but they also attacked cultural heritage, which adds another layer into this very complex subject that we're trying to cover. But maybe we haven't noticed that they not only destroyed these cultural artifacts left and right, they also, behind the scenes, made money from illegal trafficking of cultural artifacts. And there was a moment when on Portobello Road you could find artifacts from the Middle East. You could find them in New York, in London, in Tokyo. They were just spread out. So the destruction of culture, but also making money out of illicit trafficking of cultural objects was part of this.
The Yazidi part is a very brutal part of the book. I have to say I found that, and very realistic again, incredibly well researched on the basis of some of the young Yazidi women that I've met, interviewing them in the context of court proceedings. And then we jump forward now to even closer to home and in time, and 2018, and back to London, and a hydrologist.
Yeah, the third and final character, her name is Zeliha. She's the child of immigrants. She lives in London today, the Chelsea Embankment. She's determined to live in a houseboat, and she also comes from a complex background, but she's going through a difficult moment in her life. She's going through a divorce and perhaps also questioning her existential connection with life at the beginning of the book. She is someone who's studying unseen rivers, invisible rivers. The biggest rivers actually on our planet are up in the sky. They're atmospheric rivers. We don't see them, but they're with us. But then there are also underground rivers, lost rivers. And of course, London is a city of lost rivers. But not only London, New York, Moscow, Tokyo, Paris. We talk about Seine, we don't talk about the Biv. Right? Athens, beautiful Athens. When you go to Athens, it feels like there are no rivers in the city. There are, except they're under the ground, at least 3 major rivers. So what we did as humanity is, as we civilized, or as we progressed throughout history, we built our cities above underground rivers, or above rivers, that we deemed either unnecessary or insignificant or too filthy. So we covered some of these rivers and we built our entire buildings and houses and roads. But what's happening right now with climate crisis, as sea levels rise, this system is not sustainable anymore, and we're going to see more and more flash floods. Those lost rivers cannot carry this much water. So now there's a counter movement in the world, a counter awareness that talks about bringing the lost rivers into daylight, and it's called daylighting, and there are very successful examples of this in South Korea. For me, this is also an important metaphor. Just because we don't see something, it doesn't mean it's not affecting us. You know, there are family stories, but there are also family silences. Silences also shape us. What is buried and repressed also shapes us. The past, just because we have buried it, doesn't mean it's dead. It's still alive, and it's still shaping this present moment. So we need to study the past. We need to understand the past.
So taking that theme, the way in which people, communities are haunted by the secrets of others, it could be said, what are the, I mean, why we write is a complex question. But in writing this book, if you were to step back from the interwoven stories and their nuance, what is it you're hoping readers would think about? What is it in the imagination of the reader you hoped might be opened?
Yeah, such a beautiful question. You know, earlier we talked about how this was the age of angst. I think this is an age in which emotions are so important. I think everybody is very anxious in this moment in time. The only difference is some people hide it better than others. That's the only difference. So young people are worried, understandably, but so are older people, East and West. I think it's more healthier to talk about emotions. whether it's anxiety, fatigue, sometimes there's an emotional fatigue, confusion. We feel like we cannot carry this much, So many challenges are happening. If there's one emotion that really scares me, that's the lack of all emotions, which is numbness. The moment we become indifferent, atomized. Many philosophers warned us against this, including Hannah Arendt. She was very, very determined, to highlight if we become atomized individuals, each minding their own business, doesn't matter what's happening to my neighbor. If we become like that, I think it's going to become a much more dangerous world to live in. And literature, for me, is the antidote to numbness. There's a beautiful essay by Umberto Eco in which he says, as a writer, your job is not to invent connections. We're not inventing anything. Your job is only to see the connections. The connections are already out there. We are connected. Our destinies are connected. Our stories are connected. Our silences are connected. So I think I love literature because for me it's freedom. It's about pluralism. It's where my heart beats. And when people read this, if they can empathize, if they can journey into other lives and realize that actually there is no other, the other is me, the other is my brother, the other is my sister, I think that's a step forward.
And putting those ideas, we were talking just before we came out about the state of the world right now. You've just referenced it in terms of anxiety. We read the news, we see what's going on in various parts of the world. The connection with these interwoven stories and the narrative you've constructed with your own sense of what is happening right now.
That is true. And I think to the best of my ability, I would love my fiction to be a bridge builder, to build a bridge builder between written culture and oral culture, between different communities, between different countries, and where I come from, which is a very difficult, complex region. It breaks my heart that today the Middle East is mostly identified, at least in international media, either with violence, with negativities, but we're talking about an incredibly rich region, hugely diverse. It always was home to the wealthiest empires, the most complex irrigation systems, biggest libraries, but also a region that has experienced climate destruction. So for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which originated from this region, has a lot to tell us today, if just one example. But primarily coming back to the many conflicts and challenges that we're experiencing in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Ukraine, in Sudan. It's a very difficult time, but I think we have to think beyond governments. We have to connect people to people, and we have to understand, the enormous suffering and the dangers of war. How do we build a more peaceful world? For this to happen, we have to be engaged citizens. We have to be active global citizens. You might disagree with me, but I find it very sad when we think of identity as a monolithic thing, as if we can only be one thing at the expense of others. I think it's possible to think of identity as more fluid, like ripples in water. So being Turkish is, of course, a big part of who I am, but I also feel connected to the Balkans. There are elements in my soul from the Middle East that I will always carry with me. Equally, I feel European. Equally, I feel British. And despite what British politicians have told us in this country during this Brexit saga, I want to think of myself as a citizen of humanity, as a citizen of the world. So we can have these circles and circles of multiple belongings, and therefore I think it's a responsibility. And I know you're doing amazing work for peace, for reconciliation at an international level, and I know it's not easy. I try to do it via literature, but we have to be engaged in these difficult conversations.
We're on exactly the same page, Elif. It's wonderful to be with you. I think we've got a few minutes left, and now there's an opportunity to open up, and you may have your own thoughts, ideas, questions. I think there are mics. I hope there are mics if anyone wants to ask a question. Or yes, all the way at the back over there. I see someone. I think there's a microphone coming because we'd all love to hear you. Do we have a microphone coming?
I'll start by saying thank you for your very moving conversation today. It brought my friend and I actually to tears at various points. And I want to ask you about your male characters. I'm struck in the current news cycle we have
there's a mic just coming. We really want, everyone wants to hear what you're saying.
Okay. I don't particularly think I should repeat that, I don't know. I want to ask you about your male characters. I'm struck in what we read and see about the Middle East today, that many Middle Eastern men, particularly Muslim men, Palestinian men, Muslim Christian, are seen in a very negative light. A lot of clearly we see soldiers in a negative light. We see people in groups that are described as terrorists in a negative light. But I want to know, given that background and given your own personal background, what do you draw on for your male characters to be so rounded? And also, do you think, either in a direct way or indirect way, that you are trying to give a different impression of men from your original region?
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question. You know, as a feminist who has learned lots of things from past generations of women's movement, one of the things that I know is that politics is not only about, you know, what politicians did, what governments did. It's broader than that. Wherever there's a power imbalance, there's politics. I am interested in politics in that broader sense. And when I look at it like that, patriarchy is quite universal. Right? It's not concentrated in one region or another region. It's a universal problem. There isn't a single country in the world that has achieved gender equality. That said, there are degrees of patriarchy. Of course, maybe in some parts of the world, we experience it in a much more visible way. So there's a lot of dismantling that we have to do. I am very critical of the straitjacket of masculinity that is imposed on young men. As a woman coming from Turkey, I know that wherever patriarchy is deeply rooted, of course women are unhappy, but so are men. Men are not happy either, especially if you're a young, you know, man who has dreams and ideals, and if you don't quite fit into that description of masculinity, your life can be quite hard. You can be shunned, you can be ridiculed, you can be almost rejected. So I am longing for a new feminist narrative that also understands the challenges of being young man in today's world. We have to have those conversations. And we're in this together, right? And I think I also, if I may add this very quickly, I lived in Boston for about a year, and I locked myself in a library, and I studied African American women's movement, 1960s, 1970s. It was an eye-opening experience for me. When you read people like Audre Lorde, for instance, they talk about themselves in a much more pluralistic way. Many of these women came from, of course, being women, they knew how patriarchy worked. They were on the receiving end. But being black, for instance, they were on the receiving end of racism. Being many of them working class, they were on the receiving end of class hierarchy. Being LGBTQ+, many of them were on the receiving end of transphobia or homophobia and so on. So my point is, when they talk about power, they talk about power in a much more nuanced way. And I think we lost that today in today's progressive conversations. That is how I try to approach, like layers and layers of discrimination. How does it work? If you're a young man who doesn't fit into those stereotypes, how do you feel? Those are the things that I try to unpack with compassion. I think compassion is a key issue for us storytellers.
Next question, please. We have one at the front here. Was there one at the back then? And then we'll come to the front, come to you at the front over here.
Hello, Elif. It's a privilege to hear you today. I wanted to, one, make an observation, and two, see if that's something that you recognise. You talk about compassion, you just mentioned now, and I had been thinking about that, and emotional intelligence. And I do see that in all your books. But what I observe is a lack of sentimentality, and I wonder if your exposure, you're British, you're Turkish, you're European, you're Middle Eastern, you're obviously been American at some point, but I wonder if that is that intentional? Do you recognize that in yourself? I find that very refreshing. I can read a story about your story set in Cyprus. I'm from the Greek Cypriot side. My peers, my parents went through that time. But I read it not feeling one side or the other. And I wonder if your multiple exposures and openness to the places you've lived in and stories you hear prevent a bias then becoming sentimentality in the stories. It doesn't prevent the compassion, but it removes almost for me it's the beauty of it. You can be compassionate, but you don't have to be sentimental without being sentimental.
What a beautiful, what a thoughtful question. Thank you so much. And you made me think, as I was listening to you. I think I'm always interested in this dialectical relationship between melancholy and humor. I love humor. I think humor is our oxygen. It's not a coincidence that wherever in the world you see a rise in authoritarianism, humor will be the first thing attacked. We need compassionate humor, not condescending humor. So humor is a good balance. I try to approach every subject from different angles, try to be an intellectual nomad, if that's the right word. And I try not to forget that, like in my daily life, if you see me, I'm full of panic attacks and anxieties, I'm very disorganized, I don't quite know what I'm doing. But when I sit at my desk, I change. And I change not because of who I am, but because I tap into something that is older than me, that is bigger than me, and that is wiser than me. And that is the ancient art of storytelling. So that is my guide. And I think that's the beauty of art. We change. We become a little bit wiser when we, right? Do you experience that? It's such an ancient art. It's such a universal art. And within that storyline, there is no us versus them. It cannot be like that. The language of writers cannot be the language of populist demagogues or, that divisive politics is not our language. That said, I have this pessimistic streak in me. I cannot, I have to be truthful. I'm Turkish. Pessimism comes more easily to me. I think if you open a map of Europe and if you follow the river Danube with your finger, as you journey towards Bulgaria, Romania, Black Sea, Turkey, the level of optimism drops and drops and drops. So what I learned is that it's okay for the mind to be a bit more pessimistic as long as we can keep our hearts more hopeful, more optimistic. And for that, we need these connections, we need these conversations.
But you are also sentimental. You are. Yes, you are. I've seen you being sentimental.
Again, in my daily life, but we're talking about, when we're writing, we change.
Down in the front, if we could bring you've got it.
I've got a mic. Is it? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Elif, for sharing, and Philippe as well. I've been taking copious notes on my phone and in my notebook. I had a question just around complexity and distilling that into your literature, which I think you do so well, and which is one of the reasons I've really enjoyed reading your work. I think, so obviously you talked about the complexities of, the different aspects of potential identity markers that you have as a woman, as a Turkish woman, as a European woman, and all of these, a citizen of the world, all of these things. And I think that even though complexity can be very, almost seemingly absent in terms of popular discourse, I actually think that as human beings, it's actually quite easy for us to grasp it. And I think it's actually quite easy for us to grasp it, and actually relatively easy for us to articulate it when we stop and do it. But I think, at least for me, the difficulty is then distilling those themes and the fluidity and the, moving between the different kind of contexts into the written word in a way that resonates. And so I just wondered what your process was and your approach was to doing that, and how you do that, essentially.
Beautiful, thank you. And I fully agree with you. I think there's a part of us that grasps, understands, empathizes, right? That complexity. And it doesn't shy away from complexity. But the challenges, the times we're living in, constantly tells us, do the opposite. Just belong in one box and stay in that box once and forever. I think we live in an age in which we have way too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. And we have to change that ratio, because the truth is, information doesn't help us at all. If anything, it makes us arrogant or ignorant. You can ask me anything you want. If I don't know the answer, I will not tell you I don't know. We forgot to say I don't know, which was the starting point of philosophy. I will Google it. In the next 5 minutes, I will be able to say a few words to you, giving me the illusion that I know something about the subject, whereas I know nothing, right? So we have to go back to that beginning of I know nothing, but I'm here to learn. And for that to happen, we have to get rid of this romanticization of information. Late 1990s, early 2000s, there was so much optimism, and the biggest optimists at the time were tech optimists. They were telling us, if you spread digital technologies, Facebook, everybody's going to become informed citizens. Why? Because we are spreading out information. Informed citizens will make informed choices, and there's going to be democracy everywhere. The opposite is happening. So let's deal with less information, because it doesn't help us. Also, it prevents us from making genuine connections. I read just snippets of information about Afghanistan, Gaza, Ukraine, but nothing stays, right? But instead of doing that, if I can focus on knowledge, which is slow journalism, slower conversations such as these, nuanced conversations, we may agree or disagree, but we hear each other. That's important. So let's go back to festivals, cultural spaces, and then hopefully let's go towards wisdom. And for wisdom to be in the picture, we have to bring the heart into the picture. I think our hearts are always bigger than our minds. The mind is that's why, those who meditate, they call it the monkey brain. The monkey mind constantly jumps from one subject to another, always dissatisfied. But the heart is calmer. The heart is wiser. So emotional intelligence has to be part of the conversation. And that will lead us, hopefully, to a bit more wisdom. If I may add this very quickly, the one person who taught me this was actually my grandmother. My grandmother was not a very well-educated woman. Just because she was a girl, she had been pulled out of school in Turkey, and she wholeheartedly believed in women's education. And she was one of the wisest people I've ever seen. And she's the one who showed me that you can, you may not have a diploma, proper diploma, you may still be quite wise. You may graduate from one of the best, the most posh universities, you can still be quite ignorant. Right? She showed me this. So there are different paths towards knowledge, and that's why I don't want to deal with information in my daily life. I want to focus on knowledge and wisdom, if possible.
I think we've all had a taste in this past hour of why spending an hour in your pages or with you, which is we're so fortunate to do, just leaves one feeling the world is great and wonderful. You have this magical effect on people. I think you're going to sign books immediately after. It's been wonderful to be with you. And on behalf of everybody, I thank you so much for coming and spending
very grateful, very grateful. Thank you.